lectures have dovetailed very nicely into mine and given me a little bit of extra information, extra ideas, as you will. And one thing that Simon said that I'd like to elaborate a little tiny bit on within the light of why Flying Dutchman musically represents such a leap forward for Wagner. A couple of things that he said that struck me. The one thing is that when I started listening to the beginning of Flying Dutchman, just a little tiny bit of the overture, and we're going to, as we listen to the overtures of the first three, we're going to listen to the entire overture of Flying Dutchman in a minute. To me, it not only sounds incomparably better than the music of the first three, and to my ears, incomparably better. Light years better. It's not that I'm necessarily such a lover of the Flying Dutchman, but it sounds to me just like an entire different degree of order better. Better like the difference between if we've been spending our lives reading Flying Seamen comic books and we happen to pick up The Magic Mountain. The Magic Mountain is very different from Flying Seamen, but it's also a lot better. And that's the other thing, is it's not only a lot better, it's awfully different. Now, how and what way it's better is, of course, a much more difficult thing to discuss than how it's different. And I'll be discussing more how it's different than how it's better, because better is subjective and very difficult, if not impossible, to quantify, to say precisely how something is better than something else. But so many of the egregious problems, I think, that we saw in the earlier ones, the lack of continuity in particular, the lack of sense of consequentiality, that what happens at point C is a result of what's happened at point A and point B, and C leads to point D. This kind of sense of musical consequentiality, of line, of narrative direction, which is so problematic in all three of the first three, is so solved, I think, almost entirely. Not perhaps 100% yet, but so much better solved. There are a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on directly from Simon's talk before I go off in my own direction. And one is the idea of romantic art and romanticism. Because as a musician, when I see the graphs and the dates and things, any musician would be taken very much aback. And there's a very good reason for that. Because whereas in many of the arts, romanticism is actually in its last phases, in 1825 and 1830, romanticism in music is only just beginning. Music is very much behind the other arts, most of the time. Our great age of Baroque comes 100 years after the term is used to describe architecture in the beginning of the 17th century. And we can talk about it, we can see things looking backwards at that period that have elements of Baroque quality. But the great Baroque composers of us, like George Frederick Handel, probably the first one, certainly Bach and lots of others, Alessandro Scarlatti, were all dealing with composers working 1700 to 1750, when Baroque is basically dead as in the form it was originally used. You know, talking about Romanticism in 1770 and 1780, with the roots, of course, in Goethe and Strombeltan, which is a movement that Goethe is sort of kind of part of, he didn't really cause it, in the late 1700s, and Rousseau, of course. In terms of music, we haven't even gotten to our classical era yet. And of course, there are elements of Romanticism in certain parts of the classical era music, and Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. But Romanticism for music really only begins, in the usual sense, in 1825, 1830. And although Romanticism as the ideal, as Byron, which is already the second phase of Romanticism, which is so amazing for us as a musician to listen to, because our Romanticism, musical Romanticism, as its point of genesis from which it springs, is Byron. Byron is the absolute beginning. It is the launching pad for musical Romanticism. By no means a late phase, just the very beginning. But this is very, very important in the history of Wagner and the significance of Flying Dutchman. The fact is that although operas like Lucia di Lammermoor are based on highly romantic texts, Sir Walter Scott, who was practically emblematic in all respects of Romanticism, the use of exotic text, faraway places, certain romantic ideals of the triumph of feeling over duty, many elements, even the idea of the loner, the knight who doesn't fit in, so Ivanhoe. Nevertheless, the music, for instance, of Lucia di Lammermoor, or the early Italian operas of early Romanticism, bears very little in common with the things that we speak of as musical romanticism. Italian music in general is very unromantic, or is very unromantic until the end of the 19th century with Puccini, with the Rizzo opera, in a different way. Even Verdi, by our standards, now I'm speaking as a musician now, Simon, so this is, you have to take, we have our own definitions and our own terms. Verdi is an intensely unromantic composer in a way. The very fact that he's a farmer, his view of nature is something that you use. You rain so you grow your crops. If there's a lightning storm, it's a nuisance because it might kill might bring hail and kill the crops. Nature is not viewed as some kind of spiritual force in his operas. He uses it, for instance, in Rigoletto to great effect, to create atmosphere on stage, but he's not interested in nature. And in fact, it's not by accident. The Italians have almost no novelistic tradition, except for Promessi Sposi, which hardly counts. It's about all they've got. Because the whole idea of the novel, I think, is based in Romanticism. And at least as far as music is concerned, music was first called romantic because of its link to novels, to the romance. I have no idea if that's true in the other arts or not. But in music, the first talking about Robert Schumann is the first composer who's called romantic because his music is always tied to literary sources, the use of literary sources to music. I think that Wagner inherited a world in which there is this tremendous disconnect between what's happening in music and what's happening in the other arts. Wagner, from the very start, is interested in connecting music to the other arts. I think is in a terrible impasse because, as a young man in the early periods, because the music that he wants to write has nothing to do with the subject matter. Grand opera is in many respects intensely non-romantic music. It's intensely non-subjective music. It is not music about the individual. It is not music that reflects the personality of the person. It's extremely formalistic music. Now, a very interesting point is the reaction of people, which is absolutely true, to Flying Dutchman, that it was somehow old-fashioned, shows me something very significant about opera audiences of 1843, which might be true of opera audiences of 2010, for all I know, is that music was of almost no importance whatsoever. Or that the importance of music was strictly as sort of a means by which the singers could display their high notes, the chorus could make lots of noise, the ballet dancers could dance to something too. In other words, it was an element of scenic decoration. It was not really significant. I'm going to make a very radical statement now. People writing operas in the 1820s and 30s were not primarily musicians, and music is not primarily central to their music. Wagner was absolutely right, with one exception, Hector Berlioz, who's a figure very much on the side, and Bellini, who's also in a different tradition. I think we should eliminate Italian opera from this discussion, because that's a different tradition. But major music was not being written. However successful, and God knows they are successful in their own way, Meyerbeer's operas are, and they do contain some good music in it. Music is not central to their success. Music is an element which is important to their success. But the role of music is not central in the way that the role of music is central to Verdi, or to Wagner, or to Mozart, or to Richard Strauss, or to any number of other opera composers. Or really, for that matter, to Bellini. For music is very central to it. It's a certain kind of music, a very unromantic music, in my opinion, but very much very central to the music. So Wagner is looking for a world in which he can write great music that will mean something to the kind of dramas in which he wants to write. And I think that's why ultimately all the apprentice operas are unsuccessful and stillborn, as it were. Because ultimately, the kind of music that he felt forced to write, or that he felt was appropriate to write, to the kind of subject matter which he had at hand, was music which ultimately did not interest him, or did not spark his incipient genius, which was sparked immediately upon the first notes of Flying Dutchman. Now, of course, we don't know how much the story that he told in the 1860s about the voyage and the inspiration for the voyage, there's no way to know how true that is, or how much it comes from his own personal recollections. But as Simon said, it doesn't really matter. You know, Freud always says, when someone said, how do you know if the dreams they tell you are real dreams, or if they just made them up? And Freud said it doesn't make any difference. The dreams they make up reveal just as much about their psyches as a real dream they had. And this is the case of Wagner, too. In a way, it's just as significant when he tells a fake story about how he came about being inspired to write Flying Dutchman as the real story indeed. But the thing that really struck me when you were speaking, which is, I guess I knew, just really hit me over the head, is the idea that Flying Dutchman was an old-fashioned work compared to Rienzi. Because as a piece of music, Rienzi is incredibly old-fashioned and incredibly unoriginal. Including Rienzi's Prayer, which is the most successful, has the best tune. There is not, if you can name me an opera, grand opera, that doesn't have a prayer of the hero as the first number at the beginning of the last act, I'll say this one. They all Wagner keeps it up a little bit with Elizabeth. I mean, there's a little tiny bits of it in Wagner too, but it's absolutely conventional in that respect. Yes, there is some movement in the opera as he gets better at what he's doing. It actually will fit into one of the things that I'm going to talk about. But by and large, it remains extremely conventional. The first thing that makes Flying Dutchman different from the other operas is that musically, it is no longer conventional. It may be old-fashioned in that it harkens back to a kind of Romanticism, which is literarily no longer in style, and socially no longer in style. But musically, it is extremely rapid. Light years away from what other composers are writing, especially in opera. Now, it is not necessarily light years away from what other composers are writing. It is not light years away, although it's better than, music that Liszt is writing in 1842, which Wagner probably didn't know. Nor is it light years away from music that Robert Schumann was writing in the 1830s and 1840s. Again, I don't know how well Wagner even knew this music, because at this point, his background was so much in opera, the music that I think he knew best was either music of the past or music that was being written for opera. But it was incredibly new in the context of opera. Music of such freedom and power, no longer confined to periodic phrases, everything in sort of simple four-bar phrases that imitate each other. Music of this extreme dramatic sweep, music of a lot of harmonic tension, and especially music whose function was to represent a kind of interior reality, to be intensely subjective. The most subjective and most romantic of all composers is Robert Schumann. And Robert Schumann is the composer whose music sounds most like Flying Dutchman to my ears. And so, in a way, what Flying Dutchman is reconciling musical theater, opera, to what's happening in music. It's sort of the first musical opera within this tradition of non-Italian opera in Europe. So, what happens? Why does Wagner change so much? I think the number one thing that happens, if we're looking for external change, is, of course, that Wagner goes to Paris. Basically, the Flying Dutchman was written in Paris, or near Paris. There's a kind of a paradoxical situation, is that Wagner wrote the overwhelming majority of his best music, and certainly almost all of his most cutting-edge music, newest music, revolutionary music, when he was not in Germany. Whereas he wrote almost all of Rienzi, and certainly the first two operas, he wrote in Germany. He wrote Tannhäuser and Lohengrin while in Germany, true. In the Ring he wrote entirely outside of Germany. Tristan he wrote entirely outside of Germany. Meistersing he wrote entirely outside of Germany. Parsifal he wrote practically entirely outside of Germany. So even during periods of his life when he was back in Germany as Parsifal, he did almost all the writing when he was away. These long 10-month stays in Italy. That's when he actually did Tristan, of course, another case in point. Writing. Maybe there was something about not being at home, about longing for something that wasn't there, because Wagner was always intensely homesick. He hated being in Germany, but he hated being away from it as well. Which, of course, is also quintessentially romantic in a way. Perhaps that was something of liberation. Going to Paris, being away from his country for really the first time in his life, and for a long period of time, is very important. And, of course, the fact that he was miserable in Paris. that he expected all the doors to open for him. He expected to have Rienzi played with great triumph at the Paris Opera, and that he would imitate and outdo Spontini and Meyerbeer's great success there, especially because he was convinced that his work was better than theirs. Was of course dashed. He found himself, as you probably know, while in Paris, he was making a living by making cornet transcriptions of arias from La Favorita by Tony Zetti, music which I'm sure Wagner heartily despised. And feeling put upon, especially Meyerbeer was put upon him, because Meyerbeer committed to Wagner probably the most egregious offense that anyone could possibly do, which is he was actually rather kind. But nothing really concrete came of anything, but he was always very nice. I forget, Meyerbeer was immensely rich and successful, immensely busy because he was very much an entrepreneur, running around from place to place, organizing performances of his works, and he had practically no time for Wagner. Wagner's diary and correspondence in Paris is full of meetings with Meyerbeer that didn't take place. But Meyerbeer actually is rather nice to Wagner, because Wagner could never forget. Well, no, because he was nice to him in a way that Wagner later saw as being patronizing and supercilious. So Wagner in Paris was bitterly disappointed, became very well aware of his isolation, something which I'm not convinced that he was so aware of in the years before in Germany. He was just a struggling young musician, theater man trying to get jobs. But in Paris, he became very romantically aware of being a romantic hero in a way. He needed that separation. So going to Paris was an enormously liberating artistic experience for Wagner. But it was also much more liberating in another way, a more concrete way. And this is really the heart of what I'm going to talk about today, is that it's in Paris that Wagner discovers the true source of his musical inspiration. The true source of Wagner's musical inspiration is not Weber, it is not Meyerbeer, Spontini, and Cherubini, it's certainly not Bellini, it's Beethoven. And Wagner discovers Beethoven in Paris. Now Wagner knew Beethoven from scores. He made transcriptions as a young boy of the 5th, 7th, and 9th symphonies. Which would be curious to see if they still existed. But Wagner had heard very little Beethoven, and his relationship to Beethoven was very much what the relationship of people at large was. That Beethoven was this titanic, wonderful, glorious figure, but not sort of a concretely known figure. Somebody pointed out very interesting, this is an aside on Beethoven, but on the nature of his position in society. When Mozart died, as you know, the weather was bad and he ended up being thrown into a pauper's grave with 120 other corpses and no witnesses. And yet Mozart was overwhelmingly the most beloved and successful composer in the world. People say that probably 60% of the German world and 30% of the world in Europe at large knew much of Mozart's music, especially his most popular operatic tunes. Every organ grinder on the street or was playing tunes for Mozart. Mozart made fun of the popularity of Figaro in Don Giovanni, the famous place where the band on stage plays Non più andrai, the Figaro's aria from the end of the first act, and the Don says, "What is it? I heard that one too much." Mozart was wildly loved, wildly popular, but died pauper. Beethoven, when he died was buried March 28, 1827, 20,000 people went to his funeral. Probably the biggest public funeral of any figure, public or private, prince or not, that had ever taken place. The schools of Vienna had to be closed. How many of those people had actually heard any of Beethoven's music? Probably very few. Beethoven was not anything like as popular a composer as Mozart had been. And certainly not even ballpark like what Meyerbeer was going to become in the next 3 or 4 years, or any of the grand opera composers who were writing for a big theater and a big audience. And if they had heard pieces of Beethoven, it would be pieces like the Moonlight Sonata, the Septet, the First Symphony. Those were wildly popular pieces. Some colleague of mine did a doctoral dissertation on documenting live performances of Beethoven's music in Beethoven's lifetime. And what's astonishing is the pieces that we assume are Beethoven's great masterpieces. Let's say the Appassionata. Appassionata had no public performances in Beethoven's lifetime. None. 0. The Eroica had like 15 performances in his lifetime. Beethoven's music was too hard. Wasn't really very popular, most of it. Yeah, the Septet, which is not played very much now, was performed like, 15,000 times in Beethoven's lifetime. It was a wildly popular piece. But Beethoven himself, as an iconic figure, as a symbol of the great artist, as a symbol of maybe the way society had changed. You know, Beethoven is the first artist, the first composer, maybe the first artist, that I can't say, the first composer in history to have ever dined at the table with his benefactors, to have ever walked in the front door of a palace. Haydn his entire life ate with the kitchen staff. Haydn was a wildly famous and very wealthy man, and yet he dined with the servants and went in the back door. You know, Beethoven, who was actually also a rather wealthy man, although not nearly as wealthy and successful as Haydn, walked in the front door, sat at the table with Arch Rudolph, and when they were alone, called each other by their first names. So this another enormous sort of shift in the image of the artist in society, which has a lot to do, I think, with Romanticism, actually. Even though Beethoven is not a romantic composer in the sense that we think of, well, there are elements to it that are. But the image of the artist, in a way, is. I think that to Wagner, as a young man, Beethoven is some kind of a symbol, as Beethoven was a symbol to the 20,000 citizens of Vienna who went to his funeral. While in Paris, Beethoven becomes not a symbol, but becomes his mentor, becomes his point of departure as a composer. What happens to Wagner in Paris, basically, is that Wagner learns to recognize and develop within himself a musical language that will fit the operas that he wants to write, which will grow with him through the operas that he wants to write, which will give him the power and the musical means to discover himself and to become a great artist. While in Paris, there is an orchestra in Paris conducted by a German named Motivic at the Paris Conservatory, and Motivic had a very strong, it's very typically French for directors of musical societies to have a very strong didactic sense. Much later, there's Lamoureux in the society in Paris in the late 1870s and 80s, where every single concert had to contain at least 30 minutes of Wagner's music, which really brings Wagnerism to France, which is really the first country where Wagnerism as a cult begins. Habeneck does this to Beethoven in the late 1830s, 1840s. Every Habeneck concert contained a Beethoven symphony. And it is in Paris that that Wagner really got to know Beethoven and Beethoven symphonies. It's also in Paris that Wagner discovered that he really wanted to be a conductor. The idea of being a conductor. Conductors, as a profession, had not yet really begun, and didn't begin for a while. Wagner is the first. Wagner Liszt. Liszt was a total amateur, had to be sort of shown what to do. But Wagner is the first professional conductor, in our sense of the word. Not the first person who stood in front of an orchestra and didn't just give the downbeat and then go back to playing his violin or playing his harpsichord or piano or whatever, but actually was the mentor that led the orchestra, that gave them the interpretive decisions of how it was supposed to go. A very funny sort of side fact on this about the conductor, which also begins, and Wagner tells us this while he's in Paris, is that when Wagner conducted in St. Petersburg in 1862, where he met Verdi, maybe for the first time, although they probably met in Paris before. There's a review for the concert that he conducted mostly Beethoven and a little bit of his own music, and including some Tristan, actually. The guy sang that the orchestra never sounded so good and how powerful and how they played together, but people were greatly affronted and taken very much aback because he had the audacity, the effrontery, to conduct with his back to the audience. It was just kind of an amazing concept. I think that before that means that everybody conducted in order to be so like this. You're the orchestra conducting like this. So obviously, because you couldn't turn your back to the royalty and the audience. So obviously, the means of communication to the conductor of the orchestra would be pretty limited if you're not even looking at it. Anyway, so the whole, I think Wagner became, in a way, Wagner, until the stay in Paris, is a dramatist who wants to be a musician. Wagner in Paris becomes a musician, and the result of it is Flying Dutchman. Yes, he finds also a text. Another very obvious difference that we take for granted, but we haven't really mentioned, was Flying Dutchman is his first mythical subject. Now, no, Fame is mythical in a way, but it's fairy tale. It's a different. The emphasis is different. I mean, Fame makes no real attempt of conjuring up real life at all, whereas Flying Dutchman, like myth, is telling about real life music, sort of situations which are outside of time and place. But also, Fame is based directly on a story by Gauss, and is completely just his sort of version, an operatic version of the story by Gauss. Liebesverbot is a story by Shakespeare, his version of a story by Shakespeare. Rienzi is his version of the story by Woolman Lytton, and very much just an operatic version. Yes, he changes in all cases to suit the operatic text. Flying Dutchman is certainly based on a well-known story. Perhaps the one, I don't know which you knew the best word of the Heine. Yeah, probably just also linguistically. But that's not the point. Wagner takes a well-known story, but that's his own text. It's not just that he wrote the libretto of Flying Dutchman. The story of Flying Dutchman, as we have it, what it means, what its point is Wagner's. In a way that is certainly not the case of Rienzi Flying Liebesverbot to defend. It's the first opera, and then on all the rest of his operas, are really his own text. Not only his own libretto, but his own text. So, how does Wagner understand and digest Beethoven, and turn Beethoven techniques into his own music drawings? So now we're going to listen to the overture. I'm going to stop relatively soon, then we'll listen to the whole thing. So, how is this already different? One way it's different is that Wagner has given up on the supremacy of what I would call the periodic melody, a long melodic phrase. What is this all based on? Well, this is based on which is as rudimentary as you could get. Does it remind anybody of something else? Anybody know what that is? Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. First one of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Same key, same notes. This is his homage to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which he's really just discovered. The power of the small phrase, the small motivic kernel, which is basically absent from the first three operas, where he's trying to write big, long, melodic lines, and doesn't know how to get from one to the other. The problem of consequentiality, of narrative line, of progress, as it were, musically, and these other ones, these big holes in it, are very large because he doesn't have any means to connect these long lines. He's unhappy with writing the very formalistic music that allow these lines to weave their way to the end that, let's say, the Italian opera composers can do, which is not part of his tradition. It's not part of the Beethovenian tradition. But at the same time, he doesn't have the right kind of material that allows the normal flow. Because another thing that comes out of this, besides the very little rudimentary bit of material, there's basically two bits of material in this. There's this, which is rhythmic and intervallic. Intervallic refers to the amount of distance between the notes. And very memorable. You know, this one we don't go around singing it like Rienzi's prayer, but it sticks in your head. We never have to hear it again. This one we remember. The other thing which we hear a lot already at the beginning is this, which is even more rudimentary. Just this two-note thing, repeated, which here at the beginning obviously suggests the howling of the wind or some obsessive, it's a very obsessive, repetitive kind of phrase. But once again, very, very, very short. The other thing is a little bit more analytic, and I'm not going to go into. But in this unit, this first unit of the overture, it's very, very much one piece. It doesn't look for where it's going to go next. There is no moment we say, well, what's the next thing that's going to happen? Or how do we get there? Or these big holes in the narrative. It's very direct. One thing leads very much to the other. Part of that is because he avoids the dead end of harmonic resolution. For instance, when he goes, the last one, he gets loud, he goes, he doesn't like make a chord of that sort, but he goes to, he goes through chains of modulations to go to the next one. So he's not coming to rest. And when he finally does come to rest, bells continue to contribute. Classes, reading classes out. When he finally does come, I always forget that I'm old and can't see that on my reading classes. When he finally does come to rest, he comes in exceptionally Wagnerian way. This could almost be sorry. This always happens. I always forget that it's straight up and I can't use it. How many anybody can do music ears? What chord is that? Of course, it's just a plain old triad, right? But it's not. We're still in D minor. It's not a home chord. It's the dominant chord. I talked about dominant chords in Tristan. But the point here being is that he hasn't come to rest. We know that when it goes, it can't stop there. That's not going to be the end. It's going to go on to something else. So what is musical continuity based on? It's based on the sense that we get to one place and it takes us to the next place. Something which was, I think, so egregiously lacking in the first three operas. That we get to the end of a place and we're saying, well, now what's it going to do? And we don't feel that the next thing comes as a direct outgrowth of the one before. Now, it doesn't have to be, as we're going to see in a second, an expectable outgrowth. After we hear this, we would expect, or maybe, I think our instincts tell us it's going to be something in the major after such an extremely stormy minor beginning. So we could expect to hear it and to resolve it. Instead, what we're going to hear is, that's what's called a deceptive cadence in music, because it goes to the wrong place. Although it does make a certain kind of logic. But what does that do? Of course, it delays the cadence. It delays the final closure. Now, this is all sounding a little bit like as if I were talking about Tristan. This, of course, is harmonically totally different from Tristan. But already, Wagner has grasped a means to create musical continuity. A means of great power in communication by using Beethovenian small little phrases, and a means of continuity by delaying the inputs, by not having things in, but rather merge into the next things. And he's starting to develop that which, as we mentioned yesterday, he considered his greatest talent, the talent of transition. Because all of this is a transition. It's a transition from the stormy beginning to the next thing that's going to come. So let's hear the next thing that's going to come. Intervention of the dream, the redemption dream. Even here, we see first the Beethovenian element and the element of avoiding coming to a full stop. The Beethovenian element is that even though this is a long melody, the basic element of the melody is phrase, which is, by the way, one which is very common in Beethoven, for instance. The Les Educanas sonata is based on it. It's very often in music associated with the idea of farewell. Mahler will use it in his late symphonies, very much to this. But this three-note and falling phrase is the real crux of this melody, much more than the long melody line. And so it will give Wagner, as we'll see, something really to work with. Notice again that after he's finished the melody, this part, first thing, those fifths, the same notes. Even though I don't know if we hear it exactly as a rappel, as a memory of the opening phrase, I think that subliminally we pick up on that he's incorporating. There's something from that, and then this. You heard the storm. Now he's trying to change that little two-note thing into this in a completely different kind of way. And note it harmonically here. Chain of chords, each one of which leads us to the next. We couldn't stop anywhere in that chain. And where are we at the end? We're exactly where we were at the beginning. He's going through this whole long chain, which all that does is just create tension, more and more tension for resolution, which then he goes back to this transitional thing, which he's already done before, which is the same kind of state of expectation and tradition. But even within the melody, it never comes to an end. It's sort of like, almost as if it's posits a question. You know, most musical melodies, in some metaphoric sense, posit a question and then answer the question. You know, question, answer. And that's, musical melodies, that's what they generally do, in some way or another. It's just a very short and sort of violent example of it. This one, sort of like question, but he never answers it, and never does. And because this not only doesn't answer the question, it seems to take the question further. It doesn't close anything, it goes even further in it. And what does that do? That creates a sense of continuity. So Wagner is here discovering, or we're discovering before our eyes, a way that he's able to create something which he absolutely could not do in his first works, this sense of continuity, avoiding closures, creating situations where one thing leads to the next thing. The composer, by the way, who is absolutely greatest at this in the history of music and best known for it, is Beethoven. The creating a situation where each thing leads to the next thing in the sense of absolutely inexorable momentum that you can't stop Beethoven. It's like a train. Once it gets going, it keeps on going and pushes forward. And Wagner is finding his own way to do this. So now I'd like to listen to the whole rest of the prelude overture. I'll make one comment before we get to the end. So Belsby, keep kind of looking at her. we'll talk about the merits. I think not all of the overture is equally successful to the opening part. There are some places where he's still finding his way. Here, however, with the music where I just stopped, something very basic happens, which is that he rewrites the end of the overture. He's returned to this very sort of emphatic style, which does sound a little bit like all the earlier operas with the... chord being whacked out on the offbeat. The bit on the beat actually had been Rienzi, but on the offbeat it gives it a little bit more sort of impetus and sort of energy, but it's still very heavy. And all of a sudden we can play the rest. Orchestra sounds as a different orchestra. Something really very drastic happens. And in a way, it would be fun to go back and play it again. You have the Dresden version, right?
No, I'm.
You're
Dresden.
You have
I'll be playing.
the 1843.
I'll be playing.
Okay, so we'll get here. What happens? Well, you know what happens. Somebody else tell me what's happened. Why this sounds so different? Because of course Wagner rewrote the end of the piece and the end of the overture in 1861. He had just written Tristan in the meantime, as well as a lot of other stuff in the interim. And of course, it completely changes the use of the orchestra. It's just utterly different. I mean, it sort of goes to show that even though Wagner has made a light year leap forward between Rienzi and Flying Dutchman, there is still a very long way to go, especially in his treatment of the orchestra, between Flying Dutchman and Tristan in 1861. It's even more shocking than the Venusberg editions, maybe because it's so short, it's so abrupt. I mean, it's like all of a sudden it's just an entirely different sound world. The use of the harp is particularly, but the fact that all of a sudden there's these big accents have just disappeared. All these big, heavy, lumbering, Germanic, Teutonic accents are just gone. And of course it doesn't in loud anymore. The original ending is... That's the original ending to the overture. Quite different from... Wagner's found his favorite cadence in the meantime, which is... That cadence is Wagner's favorite final conclusion, sort of his redemption cadence. Anybody name some other pieces of Wagner's that end with that cadential figure? Actually, the hard thing is the opposite finds ones that don't. Well, Reinhold doesn't, but Götterdammer, the ring ends, you know, with Tristan ends with it, Parsifal ends with it. He's found it in the meantime, but he hadn't found it yet when he wrote this. So there is a big change. Yeah, I'd like to just go a little bit into the very strongly Beethoven-y, I have another half hour, so Beethoven-y elements in Flying Dutchman, in the overture and other parts, how he uses these little bits of motivic material. Now, I want to make something really very clear. I'm not talking about leitmotifs here. This is one of the big difficulties. We say motive and you immediately think that we're talking about Wagner. I'm talking about leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are phrases that take on strong dramatic associations. It's really and truthfully something which is mostly applied to the ring. And the term is not from Wagner. Now, I'm just talking now as a musician. I'm talking about just the use of small little elements in the music which occur in many different ways and which serve two purposes. One purpose they serve, of course, is it ties the music together. It avoids the problem of this lack of continuity that Wagner suffered so much for. It gives him elements to make transitions of. There are things in common that we can, for instance, if point A consists of 5 things and 2 of them continue into point B, then we have a definite continuity between point A and point B, if we see some of the same things. And it can be constantly changing because different 2 can get combined. All you need is 5 and you can create a very large piece of music. You don't even need 5, as it happens. Beethoven constructs whole movements, the first movement of the 7th Symphony, on basically 2 ideas, one rhythmic and one melodic, and it's all he needs. The 9th Symphony basically has like 2 first and last movements, basically 2 ideas, 2 or 3 maybe, and he's able to put together whole enormous pieces of music, which Wagner has discovered, and Wagner believes this absolutely firmly, that the reason this music is so powerful is because it's held together by a small amount of material, which constantly gives it both this continuity, but also gives it organic life. This gets very deep into the whole rationale of art, but especially art as abstract as music. Music is, of course, the most abstract art. And I think this is really what happens between Rienzi and Flying Dutchman. That Wagner discovers that it is possible to be a musician, which means deal in abstractions. Music is, everybody, I'm not talking here, this all makes sense to you, right? If I say music deals in abstractions. Music is the opposite of what Simon was talking about the stage. The stage is ultimately concrete. Not only is it physical, but it does everything, or traditionally did everything it could to represent real life, concrete real life. It's got people wearing recognizable clothes in recognizable settings talking to each other, which is exactly what we do in our everyday life. Music is the exact opposite of the arts. It does not have anything concrete about it at all. It may suggest emotions, but it can only suggest and evoke. It's just sounds. It does not have any place whatsoever in space, but only in time. And that time is an arbitrary time. The time that we choose to listen to it. One of the big difficulties of music in today's world is that the other arts don't necessarily, well, theater does, but don't take up a certain amount of time. The Picasso show at the Met right now is a wild success, partly because it's a wonderful show, but partly because someone can go to that show, walk through it in 10 minutes and say, I saw the most wonderful Picasso show, it was great. Someone else can go and spend 3 weeks in it and say, I saw the most wonderful Picasso show, it was great. In other words, the amount of time it takes to see the show depends very much on how interested you really are and what your level of art appreciation is. Time is not a currency, but a piece of music takes as long as it takes. Its currency is really in time. So all of these are great difficulties, and they're all abstractions. They're all things that are not concrete. They don't have an existence in the physical world. And yet theater is the most physical, perhaps, of all the arts. So how to bridge this gap in a way where you could write the greatest music and yet in a form which is in itself very concrete. And Wagner, starting with Flying Dutchman, sets about to do this. And by doing it, he liberates operatic music from all the conventions that had robbed it of its abstract power. Wagner himself comes to realize this later, and the essays in which he writes about this liberation are really the essays he wrote in preparation for writing The Ring, Opera and Drama, A Communication to My Friends, The Artwork of the Future, etc. But the actual process begins much earlier, well, not so many years actually, 6 years earlier in the composition of Flying Dutchman. So if we look, we have 3 elements basically. Yeah, 3 elements in the overture. We have that little horn call-like figure open fist. We have that little shaking figure, and we have going down. There's an episode, kind of an archaic and perhaps slightly embarrassing episode in the overture when Wagner hearkens the sailors dance. So what does that consist of? It's the same, not only the same intervals, the same notes actually, it happens, of Senta's redemption theme, although we don't know if that's what it is at this point, but of the Senta music. In other words, it's the same music. And what about this? It's just another musical way of writing that sobbing. Same phrase. So, yes, it does interrupt the proceedings, but it doesn't interrupt the proceedings to any degree as these interruptions do in Defame or in Rienzi, when we have new things coming on, we figure, how does this connect to that? How does this have anything to do with that? And we have to justify, we say, well, because this is the sailors dancing, and that's the wild sea. But Wagner has the sailors dancing being the same music as the wild sea. And the sailors dancing being the same music as the redemption theme, if you're going to call it that, the Senta's ballade theme. So there's this very, very strong organic. We get another new tune, very important. It adds sort of fanfare. But the central part is that three note going down again. Going down. And actually the way he does it later is particularly, he combines both elements. Very good. Oh yes. So we have that, which is now major. And even this, the basic part of it is this sort of opens up, but it's based on that three-note falling figure. And at the end, ends with the abbassiosis of that. And then so the whole overture, in either the original or the souped-up Paris version, is based just on these little few elements, which he metamorphizes and combines in some kinds of ways. There's nothing new in this. There's nothing in the Wagner does here which is the slightest bit new, but it's new for the world of opera. It's new to use it in terms of to depict theatrical reality, to give life and dynamism and continuity to an operatic world, which had not been any of these things, which had been about basically at this point spectacle and vocal display and grand effect. It adds an enormous power and dynamic, subjective dynamism, if we want, romantic dynamism, if we want, by incorporating techniques that are basically not just Beethoven. I'm identifying them as Beethoven because I think that Wagner discovers them through Beethoven and feels himself as the heir to Beethoven. One of the most interesting aspects of 19th century music is that, with the exception of Chopin, practically every 19th century composer claims to be the true heir to Beethoven. And the great war we have in music, which is, again, a big irony because, of course, it's so out of date with Simon's days. We have the War of the Romantics, which is a technical term about 19th century music, which takes place basically from 1840 to 1890, really. And the War of the Romantics is about who is the true heir to Beethoven. Is the true heir to Beethoven Mendelssohn and the Dresden-Leipzig line? Leipzig in particular, because the conservative music publications, which becomes later the later Robert Schumann and then Brahms becomes, and then Hanslick becomes their mouthpiece, and then the revolutionary Beethoven line, which is Liszt sort of adopts Berlioz, sort of a side issue, and then Wagner, who Liszt adopts, and then Wagner sort of takes over, and then of course the Wagnerians, and Wagner doesn't need a mouthpiece because he writes his own essays. So you have this two war, but both of what they have in common is both of them claim very vociferously to be the true heirs to Beethoven. So it's not as if you have one people saying, no, Beethoven is bunkum and we should leave him behind, and the other one saying, no, Beethoven is the past that we need to treasure. Well, they both say, even though they hate each other, the term war of the Romantics is their own. Nevertheless, they're both claiming to be the real heirs to Beethoven. And both, in their own way, are using these kinds of techniques. The way they see it going, if it take us too far afield, is radically different. But it has to do with the concept of really a form and what the purpose of music is. Okay, let's just look a little bit at later parts. When the singers first come in, the chorus first comes in, and we hear. Of course, that's the same music as that. And then when they start singing to the when the wind gets going, they're going. Which of course is the moaning motif. So right off in the very first scene, we hear those two motifs very, very predominantly. We also hear it in a much more interesting way, more surprising way, in the song the seaman sings before he falls asleep. Because that's a very traditional sort of into this sort of slightly colored, modally colored, sort of sounding kind of exotic song that the seaman sings before the Flying Dutchman makes its appearance. Obviously, the great the big Shana of the Flying Dutchman itself is dominated the music from the overture itself. So it's not really changed. It's just a sort of a reprise. There are so many examples of these three elements being transformed. I just wanted to find some of the most unexpected and I think effective. It's the beginning of the second scene, or the second act in the original version, when we have a spinning song. I'm afraid I'm going to have like another year to have somebody hold the music over for me. You know, we should get them to invest in the music rack.
Are you going to be using this again?
No, I'm done.
So I can hold this.
It may even stay. You know, the very famous of course, it sounds like spinning. He does this that winding around thing, which is I think Mendelssohn's spinning song was very popular. You probably got from that. But I think a lot of operas had spinning songs and made spinning. That actually is a rather Biedermeier scene. It shows very much normality and good innocent happiness. Of course, what Wagner uses it for is very un-Biedermeier, because he uses it to show how Senta, just in her own way, also a romantic hero, does not fit into her world. But when it's just a major version with a very sort of jolly and traditional harmonic background and all the trappings of spinning, but it's that same basic element. And even when Wagner, what time is it now? Nobody will mind if I was short, will they?
Question or two.
Well, that's a good idea. I'm going to skip a little bit and go to the. Are you going to play a lot of the duets? Are you going to play?
I'm going to play, yeah, the beginning and the end of the duet.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to take something from the duet because to show how, of course, you know, one of the temptations with Flying Dutchman, and one that we probably should avoid. Flying Dutchman is not yet a music drama in the ring sense or the later sense. Flying Dutchman is very much still a romantic opera. It's still conceived of very much in numbers. It has a lot of the traditional elements, such as opening the second act with the chorus, opening the opera with the chorus. Somebody was trying to figure out how many operas don't open with choruses before 1850. Between 1820 and 1850, it's not 1860 even. It's not easy to think of operas that don't start with choruses. I mean, there are all these conventions, and many of these conventions Flying Dutchman still does have. Flying Dutchman, and certainly the duet between Azenta and the Dutchman combines psychological, emotional elements and musical elements of much more mature Wagner, but at the same time a much more traditional kind of duet that Wagner would have ever dreamed of writing 5 years later. Certainly not 10 years later. But even already in already even Tannhäuser, certain conventions have disappeared. The kind of vocal conventions and the singing together and having we're going to be hearing that this afternoon, so I'm not going to go into it. But it is in many ways a much more conventional duet. But inside this, in the framework of this conventional duet, there is a lot of echt Wagner music drama in it. And again, even here, he also uses thematic transformation in a way which is, I think, surprising. It's a very periodic melody. Question. Answer. This is more a melody along the lines of Fliegende Holländer in a way. It's more a traditional melody, and I don't mean that in any negative way. It's a traditional melody. It's not really a Wagnerian melody. It's not. It's one that definitely harkens to the past rather than to the future of Wagner. And yet, he still he still incorporated into it very prominently at the beginning the same 3-note sort of element. So it does link itself, and he'll make that very clear because at the end of it he'll repeat. So you're right after it ends in such a way that our ears remind us. And this, by the way, is another very important Wagnerian technique, one that he'll pick up very, very much in the ring. The idea that in order for the listener recognize hidden material, Wagner will put the material in its sort of original and definitive form in close proximity to the developments. I don't know if you remember, some of you probably don't, it's been such a long time, my very first lecture here, which I think there was a lot of complaints that it was too technical. We'll see if it's too technical next time around, on the Walküre. And I was talking about how the Walküre is almost entirely, a lot of the music of Walküre is revolved around this falling scale of figures. And the falling scale in the ring has to do with Wotan Spear. And how in the middle of, we've been hearing, all these different manifestations or metamorphoses of this idea. And so to make sure that the listener recognizes where they come from, at one point, for no particular reason, I mean, there's kind of a reason, when we think it's going to go, as it has 1,000 other times, it goes, unmodified, undifferentiated form, a very clear-cut statement of the Spear motive, for no particular reason, except that what it does is it directs our attention to the metamorphoses of the Spear motive that are all around. It's a very, very common technique. One of the reasons why in the ring it's so unsuccessful to try to explain every appearance of every motive in naturalistic terms, because sometimes they're used in much more symbolic or metaphoric ways. But he's already doing it basically here, where he will take a melody which is based on, but in a rather metamorphized, very loose kind of way, but sort of precede it and after it have the original come out by itself. And so by that he focuses the listener's attention onto that. So I mean, I could actually go a lot further into many places in Flying Dutchman, where he uses these 3 basic ideas: the the open fifths at the beginning, the wailing wind idea, I can and the redemption. Those three ideas, which go all the way through the piece. And I don't think that it's really necessarily so valuable for us to follow it through. I just repeat again, he's not doing so with the idea explicitly of tying the music to elements of the drama so much as tying the music together. It's making the music have continuity and have this organic fiber that makes it a living whole. Something which I think that Wagner felt, that certainly his own works, but that opera in general was lacking at his time. Okay, so I think I'm going to close on this for now. And anybody have any questions? Yes.
Would you review his timing on the overture and the revision of the overture?
Sure. We don't know, and Flying Dutchman was written so fast, and he tells us so much about the composition of Flying Dutchman afterwards. But presumably Flying Dutchman was one of those rare pieces where the overture was written before the work. But it could have been written kind of in and out. But the work was basically written in a few weeks in 1842 outside of Paris. In 1861, Wagner did a revision of Flying Dutchman, in which he changed a couple of things. But really, the two main things he changed were the end of the piece and the end of the overture. And he changed in the way that we just heard there. So there's a gap of 18, 19 years. Quite a long time. The debut of Flying Dutchman is 1844, right?
It was 1843.
1843.
And he actually rewrites them. I was just checking my notes. 1846, 1851. That was the change.
Yes, but not this one. Yeah, he already was changing it. One of the interesting things about, and this I think says something about Wagner's finding himself, is that the only two of his works that he did, Wagner is kind of notable among composers that he doesn't change his works. He doesn't make revisions. And the only two works that he made revisions of are Flying Dutchman, where they're relatively minor, and then, of course, the Tannhäuser, which they're extremely major, and which he was never satisfied with. And then, because after Lohengrin on, Wagner never really changes anything. The only change he made, one change in Lohengrin, is he made the famous cut of the second stanza of Inferno, which remains to this day. But other than that, he didn't really change anything of substance in Lohengrin, and he certainly never changed anything in the later works. And I think that reflects that he's finding himself. I also think, though, it reflects that Wagner did have some interest in Flying Dutchman. Wagner said that he did not want Flying Dutchman to be played at Bayreuth, but then that was, Cosima did have it played at Bayreuth. It's been played at Bayreuth since about 1890, I think. Yeah, 1891, sticks in my head. So, not so many festivals after Wagner's death, they introduced Flying Dutchman. But Wagner was very interested in Flying Dutchman, and it's shown by two things, I think. One thing, of course, is the fact that he revised it. If a creator is not interested in the work, he doesn't bother to revise it. He just discards it. But I think even more significant is the fact that in 1864, when he's dictating or writing Mein Leben with Cosima, still Cosima von Bülow at this point, he goes to great lengths to describe the composition of Flying Dutchman. And he describes Flying Dutchman as all growing out of Sentis Ballade. That Sentis Ballade, which of course the main kernel, which is this thing, and the whole concept of redemption and everything, was the kernel of the opera. That all grew from that. That was the first idea, along with the storm. And that everything kind of grew out of Sentis Ballade, which was the kernel of the piece. And of course, as I was showing you, to a large extent that's true, actually. But I think a lot of the reason he wrote it in the book this way is he is incorporating Flying Dutchman into the Wagnerian canon. He is turning it into a work about redemption, perhaps it is, but perhaps more in a way that was not entirely what he had in mind when he wrote the piece in 1842. But that is still nevertheless very significant, because it shows that Wagner cares about Flying Dutchman enough to sort of modulate, let's say, or fudge on the way it was written. I don't think Sentis Ballade was actually, Robert Bailey, who knows more about the sources and the sketches than anyone else I know of, says that it's absolutely, none of the early sketches of Flying Dutchman are Sentis Ballade at all. And some of these elements are already apparent in other material. And the early working up of Flying Dutchman is much more traditional. Flying Dutchman became much less and less traditional as it went along. So it didn't actually come about as Wagner describes it in Mein Leben. But it doesn't matter. Because what that shows is that just the Wagner is finding himself. But it shows also that it been enough to Wagner that he changes it to make it look that way. Yeah?
The sense of a lot of music sounds to me a little churchy.
Mm-hmm.
And you say you came back to that later. Does that have any significance?
Well, I think that one reason it sounds churchy, partly because of the orchestration for wind, so it has this chorale sound kind of sound. And it does have a slightly chorale sound. Well, the only, I mean, certainly both Lohengrin, Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, and in a completely different way, Meistersinger, contain elements of music that sound churchy. Leave Parsons all aside for a second. And the association I think that Wagner has with churchy music is by and large chorale. And that's just because he's Lutheran German from where he comes. And so I think that I think that the reason for it in her sound, first thing is he's looking for contrast. So winds is versus the wild chromatic string writing of the storm with the brass interposing these sort of interjections of the bom 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 bom, the Dutchman music, and so it's just a big contrast in the world. But also perhaps here, this is just very personal. I don't know the reason, but I think that the one thing that Wagner is not yet capable of doing in Flying Dutchman is creating passionate music, passionate as in eros, with any conviction. The end of the Love Duet, the part I just played, is the most conventional music in a way in Flying Dutchman. And the part of Flying Dutchman that could almost sound like it's coming out of not so much Rienzi as actually Liebesverlob. Right? It's very close to one of the big themes in Die Fame, actually, very close to a big theme in Die Fame, harmonically, but really very close to that. And Wagner has not yet found a way to express that kind of passion. And the wildness and anger and torment and all the kinds of things of the Dutchman, yes, I mean, I think it's very, right from the very first note, very convincing. But this perhaps is something that comes to a little bit later. Even in Lohengrin, I don't think he's quite found that yet. Surely the most, although there's other factors, but surely some of the least convincing music in Lohengrin is, put it this way, it's a pretty weird wedding night. I mean, think about that. It's very sort of staid and formal sounding music they sing for their love duet, if they're getting ready to go to bed on their wedding night, kind of strange for a composer who's next going to write Tristan a few years down the line, or his first act in overture. He hasn't quite found that part of his voice yet. So I think that to find these feminine elements, he finds it somewhere else. So he finds it in the world of chorales and this kind of sort of that image of a woman, rather than perhaps a more passionate woman. But that's just a personal interpretation. Yeah.
You said that he wrote in 2 months. He wrote in 1842. Does that include the libretto as well?
Yeah. Yeah. But probably very sketchy. I mean, that's what he says himself. He wrote it very fast. Flying Dutchman is the work he wrote the fastest of all of his works. And it's also short, but I mean, by Wagner's standards, it's very short. But it certainly is the work he wrote the fastest. Also, he wrote it in Paris. He actually finished. Rienzi was not completely wrong in Paris. The improvement in the last 2 acts of Rienzi also could be ascribed to the fact that he was liberated by being away from Germany. I really would not underestimate that Wagner needed to get away to find himself. That's not so uncommon among artists. One thing that I have not mentioned that I think is worthwhile bringing up about Beethoven. Yesterday, Simon was talking about sort of the source, the great romantic source figure for German Romanticism is E.T.A. Hoffmann. And E.T.A. Hoffmann was also a composer. A sonata of whom I just played in my series on classicism. A very ironic thing because E.T.A. Hoffmann, as a composer, is incredibly conventional. And E.T.A. Hoffmann, however, wrote that the only path, this is quote, the only path for musicians of moment in the future is that of Beethoven. That the only way that could lead musicians to find true expression, he wrote this in 1806 too, it was a long time ago, is in Beethoven. And in a way, and then he recommended people to use Gott-See as their text, which is of course the person who is behind the text of Die Fame, which doesn't sound anything like Beethoven at all. But neither does Hoffmann's music. iota, that doesn't have an atom of Beethoven in it. But he, again, it's this disjoint between Beethoven as this enormous figure, which somehow they recognize as great power, and actually coming to grips with what his music is and how they can use it. And I really think the Flying Dutchman is the beginning in terms of the world of opera. It's not, and not just the world of opera. Actually, even though, let's say, Schumann and Liszt, and Berlioz to some extent, in the 1830s, are wrestling with how to bring music forward from Beethoven. And they try to incorporate things of Beethoven's into their music. Actually, they're not very successful. They write great music. Schumann wrote all of his greatest music, I think, in the 1830s. But as expressions of when he tries to incorporate Beethovenian ideas, he's not very successful at that. He's successful at other things completely. And perhaps Flying Dutchman really is the beginning of music, of finding a new way to go forward from Beethoven. I mean, that's a big statement. But certainly, we were talking about Brahms. And of course, Brahms when Flying Dutchman was written was 9 years old, so Brahms hasn't come into the picture yet. And Mendelssohn is the sort of innate, and Chopin in his own way too, were innate classicists. But they take much more from Mozart than from Beethoven. Even though Mendelssohn wanted to be the follower of Beethoven. He's an early guy, he writes pieces very much with Beethoven in mind. He knew Beethoven's music probably better than any of these people, until Wagner, much later on. So, anybody else? Yes?
Just an observation, I was struck when you were emphasizing this two-note treble figure in the overture, that there's another opera which focuses on a treble protagonist, a social outcast in the midst of a stormy sea, and that's Peter Grimes. And at the very opening of Peter Grimes, if I recall, you have high violins, several iterations of a similar two-part or two-note figure, and I wonder if that was written as homage to Wagner.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Peter Grimes has a lot in common, on certain, at least kind of superficial level, perhaps, with Flying Dutchman. Britain didn't like Wagner, but that's for more historical reasons than anything else. But indirectly, Britain is in very many ways an heir to Wagner. I mean, his conception of opera owes a lot to Wagner. And his music, the composer that Britain sort of publicly swears the greatest debt to is Mahler. And of course, Mahler is a great Wagnerian, although there's a lot about Mahler which is not very Wagnerian. Yes, I mean, part of it is also kind of one of these accidents. They're both writing music where they're describing the wildness of the sea, and the sea is a force of isolation and sort of anti-society and anti-normalcy. And so there's certain things that sort of are in the air. But one thing has to be said. We say that, oh, this sounds like sea music before Flying Dutchman. But I know of no music before it. I mean, Mendelssohn wrote several pieces which conjure up the seas, but they don't use any of the sort of techniques of Flying Dutchman. I mean,
Carabini, Medea's overture.
yeah, that's some of this.
That has a lot of steam.
Yeah, and that's probably a good example. I have to listen to that again. And there's actually, Carabini has, in a completely different context, in a totally different kind of opera, Carabini is a composer who does contain elements of Beethovenian things. And of course, Beethoven admired Carabini. One of the only living composers that Beethoven had nice things to say about. He actually had nice things to say about Rossini. Did you know that? But he says something very interesting about Rossini. He says, please stick to comedies. Your opera series are boring. Right? Only comedies. I would personally agree with, but and of course Schubert, he said nice things about it. But Beethoven, like so many composers, like Wagner himself, found it much easier to talk about dead composers than live ones. Just to give you an anecdote that always moves me a lot. As you probably know, Beethoven went to Vienna to study with Haydn. He was supposed to go to Vienna to study with Mozart, but then he had to go home because his mother died, and he had to support his family. And then Mozart, of course, then dies, and then Beethoven, 6.5 years later, gets a really fantastic scholarship. This Count Waldstein paid Haydn an absolutely unprecedented amount of money to take Beethoven as a student for 5 years. And the student in those days did something quite different than it does today. He was basically taking him in as supposedly as like a boarder and to be a true mentor, father figure. I mean, the letter that Waldstein wrote to Haydn, and it really makes it really very clear what he has in mind. Haydn and Beethoven didn't get along very well. And actually, early on, within about 2 years of Beethoven's period with Haydn does something just frightful to Beethoven, which is he accepts this second visit to London, where he goes for almost 2 years and doesn't take Beethoven with him, which Beethoven and everyone else took for granted that he would. And he leads Beethoven to Vienna to study with Salieri and Albertsberger, both of whom Beethoven despised. And although he may have learned something from them, but still he despised them. Beethoven by this time was already a very accomplished composer. This is not, he has, right, Opus 1, Opus 2, these are the first opuses. So Beethoven has a lot of work under his belt by this point. Unlike Wagner, most composers by age 24, age 25 are already definitely finding their voice and have lots of technique and experience. So Beethoven and Haydn's relationship with Beethoven was not good. I mean, of course, he's still his student and he still dedicates the pieces, but Haydn always refers to Beethoven as our great mogul, which is making fun of the fact that Beethoven is so arrogant, but also foreign, because he speaks with a strong Rhinish accent. And Beethoven makes, Haydn is jealous. Is what Beethoven did. Students the world over who don't get along with their teachers have always said that teachers are jealous. That's standard currency. However, when Haydn died in 1809, Beethoven spent a fortune having an etching made of the house in Hungary where Haydn was born, and put it up, and it stayed in his house, whatever house he lived in, until he died. And when you went to visit Beethoven from 1809 on, the first thing you had to do when you went to his house was Beethoven would take you into the house, take you to this etching, and say, "Look at this modest house that such a great man was born." It's very, very, very moving, I find. But it's very interesting. He did that after Haydn died.